Hello and welcome to this video guide to film and camera basics. The purpose of this video is to introduce you to a few key concepts and ideas that relate to the learning activity you will complete during the workshop. Don't worry if you struggle with any of these points, as we will be exploring and discussing them in more detail during the session. The idea of this video is to familiarise you with the basics that will allow you to better engage with the workshop and help ensure that all the participants start from the same place in terms of prior knowledge. Please feel free to make notes if you find this helpful, and pause, rewind, and rewatch as much as you like. There will be a quick quiz at the beginning of the workshop that will assess your understanding of the content discussed in this video. During this video, we will look at how photographic film works, how SLR cameras work, what their main components are and what they do, exposure, what it is and how to control it, how to meter light for exposure and decide on your exposure settings, and the additional effects of aperture and shutter speed. Black and white film comes in many different sizes and brands, but it all works roughly the same way. The film contains millions of little particles of silver that are sensitive to light. So wherever the light hits the film, these areas will become black later once the film has been processed. This produces a negative version of the photo. It only takes a fraction of a second for the film to become exposed, so you must make sure to never open your camera when it has film inside. This would fog the film and you would lose your photos. The film is rolled up in a cassette and sits in the back of the camera. As you take each photo, the film is wound onto the next frame until you reach the end of the film, which is normally about 36 photos. You would then rewind the film back into the cassette before opening the camera and removing the film, ready to be processed. Different types of black and white film vary in how sensitive they are to light. This is shown by their ISO rating. Some are less sensitive to light, so they can be used in very bright situations without being overexposed. These have a low number, such as ISO 50 or 100. Some films have a higher ISO rating, such as 400 or 800, meaning that they are more sensitive to light and better for using when it is darker, such as inside buildings or on cloudy days. You should pick the most suitable ISO film for the situation that you are shooting, although ISO 400 is a good average that will be suitable under most normal conditions. All cameras are essentially just light-proof boxes that can be adjusted to allow a specific amount of light into them, where they will have some way of recording the light, using either film or a digital sensor. SLR stands for single lens reflex. These cameras have one lens that you can both look through and record the image through. Light enters the lens where it is focused. It passes through the aperture, which is just a hole whose size can be adjusted to determine the amount of light that enters the camera. The light then hits the mirror and is reflected up into the viewfinder, allowing us to see what is going to be photographed. When you press the shutter button, the mirror pops up out the way, allowing light to enter the back of the camera where it passes through the shutter curtain, and eventually hits the piece of film behind it. This shutter curtain only allows the light to pass through for a specific amount of time, allowing you to control precisely how long the film is exposed to light for. So to summarise, the lens focuses the image, the aperture controls how much light enters the camera, and the shutter controls how long the film is exposed to that light for. In photography, we use the term exposure to describe the amount of light that has hit the film. The key to being a good photographer is setting up your camera correctly in order to create the correct exposure. Not too bright, which we would call overexposed, and not too dark, which would be underexposed. So you can think of exposure as the brightness of the image. You need to adjust your exposure settings on the camera depending on the different lighting situations that you might be in. There are three things that control the exposure of the image: the ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. Because we're shooting on film, we won't be able to change the ISO once we start shooting, unlike with digital. So we can simply say that the ISO is fixed. That means that we only have the shutter speed and the aperture with which we can adjust the exposure. Shutter speed is measured in fractions of a second. The smaller the fraction, the shorter the amount of time that the light can expose the film, so the darker the exposure, and vice versa. Aperture is measured in f-stops, which range from around f1.8 to f32. Confusingly, the smaller the f-stop number, the larger the aperture hole, and therefore the more light that can enter, and therefore the brighter the exposure. So an f1.8 would be a very large hole and would be very bright, and f32 would be a very small hole and very dark. Inside the camera there is a light meter. It measures the amount of light coming into the camera and tells you, based on your current ISO, aperture and shutter speed settings, whether the image will be over or underexposed. You can then adjust one or more of these settings until the meter says your exposure is correct. It is important that you meter the light every time the lighting situation you are in changes. So if you are photographing outside and suddenly it becomes cloudy, you would need to re-meter the light. In this particular camera, rather than telling you if the image will be over or underexposed, it instead just tells you the shutter speed that you should be using to get the correct exposure based upon the current aperture chosen. It is basically doing the same thing, it just has a different way of telling you. If you are shooting and the light meter tells you the image is going to be over or underexposed, it's your decision as to whether you change the aperture or the shutter speed in order to correct this. And as we already know, you cannot change the ISO because it is a fixed value determined by the type of film that you've used. When you're deciding whether to change the aperture or the shutter speed, you should consider the effects that these will have on your image and use this to determine which one you're willing to compromise for the correct exposure. A slow shutter speed, such as 1/4 of a second, will make any motion within the image quite blurry, such as the person running along a track, their movement will be blurred. A fast shutter speed, such as 1/500th of a second, will freeze any motion, keeping the subject sharp. There are times when both of these options may be preferable, and so there is no best shutter speed to use. It all depends on what kind of photograph you're trying to make. If you wanted to capture the movement of a dancer, for example, you may want a slow shutter speed in order to blur their movements. But also, if for example you were photographing a racing car, you may want to use a fast shutter speed in order to freeze the motion and keep the subject sharp. A good tip to remember with these cameras is that using a shutter speed of 1/60th of a second or faster will freeze any kind of blur caused by the hand holding of the camera, just the movement of the photographer's hands themselves when taking the photo. With aperture, using a larger aperture, such as f1.8, will give you a shallower depth of focus, which basically means that the background of the image will be really out of focus. If you use a smaller aperture, such as f32, more of the image, including the background, will be sharp and in focus. Again, there are times when both of these effects could be desirable, so it's up to you to decide whether it is important for your image. It is the job of the photographer to be aware of the creative effects of shutter speed and aperture when determining exposure settings, and being able to balance these in a way that gives the correct exposure without compromising the desired effect. For example, let's say you are photographing a landscape with your camera on a tripod. Because this is a landscape shot, you'd probably want to try and have all the image in focus, so you would use a small aperture such as f32. And let's say, for example, you had your shutter speed set to 1/60th of a second. You meter the light and the camera tells you the image is going to be underexposed by 1 stop. In this case, you would probably choose to use a lower shutter speed in order to correct the exposure, because this is less important to you as you are using a tripod and nothing in the image is moving, rather than changing the aperture, which is vital to getting everything in the image in focus. So you would set the shutter speed 1 stop slower, which would be 1/30th of a second, and then take the photo. And that's it. That's how to shoot in manual mode using an SLR camera. Thanks for watching.